Hello. This is Derek from One River Tea and Tao Teaware. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so I'm probably going to do something I haven't done before at the beginning of this episode and acknowledge the 3-month gap that I've had between this episode and the last episode. I usually don't do this for posterity's sake, where I imagine a lot of people are going to be listening to these episodes back to back to back to back. They'll be binging them. And so it kind of feels weird when somebody is like, you just listened to episode 36, you hop on to 37, and the guy immediately apologizes for the long delay. And you're like, there was no delay. It just went from one episode to the next. Anyways, I'm mentioning that I've had a 3 months off here just because a lot has happened. Sometimes for creativity, I feel like creativity is this breathing in and breathing out. It's like how you make any progress. It's left foot, right foot. And so whenever you have this sense of like a writer's block, the best thing to do is just get out and experience the world, right? I mean, there's nothing worse than listening to somebody who has no world experience tell you about their world experiences, right? I mean, for me, this is always the cure to my kind of stagnation. It's like I need more life experiences before I can really feel like I can start talking about them. Naturally, tea soup was my remedy to this because I had too many life experiences and I realized I hadn't shared them with anyone. And so getting into this episode, we'll talk about Dong Guo. We'll talk about the Ma brothers. We'll talk about kind of their more natural Taoistic kind of way of life and making tea. I'll talk about how I found out about them. A lot of cool stories to come here. But in the meantime, let me tell you what I've done in the past 3 months, right? Like we've done really well with One River Tea. It's almost becoming too busy. I've always kind of treated this almost as my side job because for me, ideally, I would love to have my own tea company and that foots all the bills. But I also have Alex's the same way. Like we have certain tenants, right? Like we're not overcharging this. We're keeping everything's fair. We're doing this in a very Marxist way of like, if we buy the tea for X amount, how can we justify charging this amount? It's by added value. It's about added labor, right? Here's the labor of the tea, and how can we justify charging more than that labor with our own labor? Anyways, for me, it's always been a balance between that. And so when I say that One River Tea is finally doing well, I mean like I'm actually thinking maybe I could quit my day job and just do this full time. It's been doing so well. We've actually hired an employee. And this idea of hiring an employee is actually against the One River Tea Cooperative's model, right? Like we want everyone who's working with us to be part of the cooperative. And so there's kind of this idea, she's a Chinese just graduated student. She was going into, education, going to be a kindergarten teacher, discovered she hated it and is now trying to find other jobs. And so, yeah, like we're giving her all of the benefits she would need that she would get from a regular job. And then Alex is talking to her and Xiaoyan's talking to her like if she's a good fit, if she really likes it, if she wants to commit, she could be part of the One River Tea Cooperative. And it seems like she's just not really into this idea, which is interesting to us. But again, it's just new waters, new experiences for One River Tea, elements of growth. We don't have all the answers yet, but we'll find them out. That was a big thing. We've also sold out of a lot of teas. We sold out of the first Grandmother Mountain. I say the first there because if you know about us, we repressed it. And so there's a Grandmother Mountain 2.0 you can get your hands on. We sold out of the Antiquity. This is an wild 2016, I believe, Chomei that I got from Taimushan, Zhang. Really beautiful tea. I'm sad to see it go and he doesn't have any more stock of it. And so I can't just repress it. I'll have to keep my eyes out for a really nice aged white tea within that range. We sold out of the forbidden fruit. This is a white tea from last year from Kuashan. Really, really sweet. And this was a weird tea that it didn't sell very much for like a year. Like it sold pretty well when we first got it, and then didn't sell for a long time. And then like a month ago, people just started buying it like crazy. I have no idea what happened. Maybe somebody mentioned it on a forum, somebody who has sway talked about it, and people just started picking up on it. And then by the time like it started getting popular, we were already running out of stock. Like by the time people started buying it, we didn't have any left. And so it was kind of tragic because, people really wanted it right when we didn't have any more of it. But again, it's pretty exciting to be at this phase where things are, selling out within the year that we press them. I might talk about this later in the episode where when you're pressing teas, you kind of have to weigh the idea of tying cost up into stock, right? Like we only have so much capital, and Alex and I have been funding this entirely by ourselves. Like we haven't taken out any loans. We've just been footing the bills. And so when we want to grow, we have to spend the money ourselves and then just hope that it pays off. And so, yeah, who knows why these teas are selling, but it's very exciting. A few other things in my personal life. I went to Beijing. I worked with my girlfriend to get a visa to America. I introduced her to my family. I got engaged to her. I bought a car. a lot of big things in my life here in China, because maybe I'll talk about this if we want a personal tangent later, but the marriage customs here in China are very intense, right? Very strict. Like there's a lot of boxes you need to check in order to get married. And so there's a lot of pressure on Chinese youth, especially the males, to buy a house, to buy a car, to find a good job, to save up money, to pay for a really expensive wedding. These are kind of like all expectations that the young males in China have if they want to get married. And so, yeah, a lot of the younger guys I meet, like they're just working so hard, trying to save up, trying to buy a house. And the housing market here is pretty wild. It's a whole nother podcast to talk about the housing market in China, but it's very expensive. The population is very high. The demand is very high. And yet it's kind of like a bubble. We're kind of hitting that recession, that post-COVID recession where housing prices are just plummeting. And so the value of something you bought, 5 years ago has diminished 50%. And it's like, but you needed that house in order to get married. And so there's really very few workarounds here. Anyways, this podcast is not necessarily about how to get married in China, but that is something that has been new in my life recently. Another more likely relatable element of my life, a new development, is I actually got a PS5. This was a gift for my birthday that's coming up. And it's a PS5 with kind of a singular intention. Singular intention is to play Sun Wukong Black Myth, that Monkey King game, because it's really cool. It's like the first entirely Chinese made game that's really at this level. What's really nice about this, after studying so much Chinese cultures, I think people see a lot of soft power that comes out of Asia. Japanese culture, the video games, the anime, stuff like that. And they just all lump it together. And then playing this game, seeing the aesthetic of this game, the characters, the gods, the spirits, the whole ideology behind it, it's very distinctly Chinese. Like it's based off the Journey to the West, which is one of the 4 classic Chinese novels. Journey to the West, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, The Water Margin, and The Dream of the Red Chamber. Journey to the West, very similar to The Water Margin, is kind of like a graphic novel. It's like the first superhero. It's an action movie. It's a comic book. It's really cool. There've been so many shows in China about this monkey who essentially journeys to the West to gather the sutures, and he becomes a Buddha, and he takes on the celestial court. All the gods in heaven, he's at war with them because they are corrupt, they are cruel, they are indifferent, and he's just fighting them all. And so you start this game, And your whole mission is to just fight the court of heaven, which is, totally diabolical in like the Western mind, I would say. However, another cool thing about the game is like it is very Taoist in a lot of its elements. You get these really wild, raw, natural, shamanistic characters. You're changing into different animals. The spirits are all very earthy. And on top of that, the gameplay is great. Anyways, this is not a podcast all about how you should play Song Wukong Black Myth, which you really should if you like Souls-like games. Like I'll fight bosses. Anyways, I'm cutting myself off there. Maybe it'll come up later in the episode, but let's get into the heart and soul of this episode. So getting back to where we left off in the last episode, well, I was just up in Shaohusai, that village, that poor people village, that's the translation of it, where I found that really good tea. We blended it together. I was up on that really steep slope of the mountain, ate some food with the pickers, and really was able to see a really nice, clean, professional tea-making facility. And then from there, we went down the slopes of the mountain, not the slopes, but along the ridge of the mountain to Dong Guo. Now, before I tell you about Dong Guo and the people I found and the teas I found there, let me back up a little bit and tell you how this tea got on my radar. I'm actually, I think, an interesting person to be sourcing teas because I don't do a whole lot of research. Now that sounds kind of funny because I do a lot of research after the fact, but before I source the teas, I kind of leave myself open to fate. This is me trusting the luck. This is one of the early episodes I talk about. I'm always kind of paying attention to these small signs. And so when I'm looking for teas, I'm usually being very receptive, entering a flow state and kind of seeing what jumps out to me. This time, it actually, Dong Guo, the reason I wanted to find Dong Guo, this came from Jürgen, the guy behind Tea Addicts in Germany, or the tea dealer. I met him in this year, in March, I think. He was at the very end of his month-long tea odyssey through China, and I was just starting mine. We met in the Westlake area, and we found that 108 Dragon Well together from Little Ma. And Little Wong, actually, sorry. Her tea house is called like the Green Horse, Luma. But yeah, we found them together, and it was really cool because I was hanging out with Jürgen, and we were just talking about teas. He had already gone through Mengku and Linsang, and he was telling me what he really wanted to get, what he really liked to find. And he mentioned two areas that I hadn't heard before that I was pretty curious about. He said Dong Guo and Molière. He was like, Molière has really, really beautiful teas, but they're a little too expensive. And I will tell you, I did find that out myself. This is Molière, sometimes they call it Little Bingdao, because it has really nice, gentle, creamy, sweet teas, but they're really expensive, more expensive than Shaohusai. But he was telling me that Dong Guo had some pretty interesting things, but it was kind of hard to find a good source sometimes. And so I put that on my radar, and I kind of let it sleep in my subconscious. And so when I get into Linsang and I'm talking to Lanche, and she mentions, oh, I have a little bit of Molière. This is a little Bingdao. I'm like, Molière? That sounds familiar. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm interested about Molière. And then she's like, yeah, Molière, and then Dong Guo is very next to it. I'm like, oh, I heard about Dong Guo. And so we drank through Molière, we drank through Dong Guo. And Molière was beautiful, but like I said, it was just too expensive. You know, like last year I pressed some cakes that were probably too expensive for people. Like I'm thinking of the Huazhu Liangsa Pure Gushu from 2021, the Tree Spirit. That tea has not sold. It's like $1 a gram, press it in 200-gram cakes. Nobody wants to pay that much money, it seems. And so here's one interesting aspect of sourcing and buying teas. Naturally, I'm buying teas that I like, teas that I want to drink. But sometimes when I'm pressing teas, I have to buy a lot. I have to buy 10 kilograms, 15 kilograms, 20 kilograms. I have to store a lot of money in product. And then if I store a lot of money in product, I can't buy new teas. And so like I'm kind of waiting for that Huazhu Liangsa to sell before I can buy new teas. And so I looked at Molia and I was like, okay, like this year I'm just going to buy what is more affordable that does taste good. And even though this tastes beautiful, I'm not going to press like a boutique tea. You know, I'm not going to press a bohatong. I really actually, Bitter Leaf just pressed a bohatong this year from Iwu. It looks so good, so expensive, and I really want to try some. But I even for me, you know, it's too much money. Like even like if I was gonna try and get some wholesale to press or whatever, it's way too much. Ugh. Anyways, Molia out of the price range. Dong Guo, I was like, okay, let me try this Dong Guo. And we drank some Dong Guo and it was pretty good. And she was like, oh, this is the Gushu. And the Gushu is like twice as expensive as the Chaomu. And I was like, that's interesting. And she's like, yeah, but the Chaomu is not good. No, Chaomu means younger trees. It's still like tea trees and not tea bushes. Could be, you know, over a meter tall, 2 meters tall. But she was like, the Dongguo it's kind of Gushu or nothing. Because and I was like, I don't know, like let me try this and make the decision for myself. Because a lot of times, like in the tea world, people will tell me their opinions. And if I believed every opinion I ever heard about tea, I would be totally messed up. And so at some point, you have to trust your own taste, trust your own palate, trust your own decision making. And so I asked her, I was like, hey, can we try some of the Chow Mu? And she's like, okay. And so we went out, got some samples from some of her friends, different Chow Mu from Dong Guo, from different makers. And we tried them all together, and they were all terrible. I could not do it. It was really astringent, slightly sour, and really it felt like biting into a lemon without peeling it first. It was like the pith of a lemon with a little bit of citrus. Ugh, it was really not good. And then when we tasted the gushu, it was a completely different story, like 100% different. And that's when I was like, okay, Lanja, like we have the same opinion here. Like you were totally right. Thank you for indulging my curiosity. But yeah, let's just do the gushu. And we were drinking some 2023 gushu. Now this is tea from last year. One thing to keep in mind, maybe you probably don't need to, but one thing that I should tell you that I need to keep in mind when I'm sourcing Puer tea in spring is almost 100% of the time, tea from last year will taste better than the tea they just made a week ago. And this is, tea has this like sense of like it has ups and downs. It's like the way it ages, it's like a sine wave. As soon as it's made, the leaves undergo so much stress, so much heat, so much pressure, so much change. Maybe I'm getting a little metaphysical to it, but they're under a lot of pressure and they don't have time to settle down into their true flavors. And so if you taste a tea right after it's made, it is not the same tea as it will be in a month. And even so, a tea after a month is not the same tea it's going to be after a year. And so when you're trying to compare teas from this year that was just made versus last year's teas are always going to taste more pleasant, more suitable. However, what you need to do is you need to have that future thought of how will this tea age? I'm actually, right now as we're doing this, drinking through a lot of Dansong oolongs. And so this is definitely on my mind. A lot of the teas I'm drinking, they were roasted really recently. And so have a lot of heat, a lot of charcoal, a lot of just like really, really fiery taste to them that I know will dissipate. I actually have some Youhuashang, some pomelo flower fragrance from Master Wei. And he just sent me the new batch and it's good. But I made the mistake of comparing it with last year's. And where this year's batch is great, it's roasted, it's toasty, it's sweet, it's oily. Last year's tea is phenomenal. Like last year's tea is so chill, sweet, fruity, oily. It's everything this tea should be. But like this year, it's still like the roast is too soon. And I'm sure in 5 months, in 6 months, in fact, I got a message about this tea like 8 months after it was made, somebody was like, that tea is the best tea, the best dansong. I don't like dansong, but that dansong is great. This is from Mark Moeller, Sanguine Teapots. And he was just like, that Yo Hua Shang is incredible. And I was like, really? Like, I don't have any more of it, or I didn't think I had. I found a little bag. And yeah, it was, it took a long time for it to really peak. And by the time it peaked, we were sold out. That's the sad part about this. And so too, this comes back to sourcing teas, buying pu'er, pressing pu'er, thinking about the long haul. Like I have the Mongfei, the late bloomer. I particularly named it that because I had some aged Mongfei and I really liked it. And then I had some fresh Mongfei and I didn't like it so much. And I was like, okay, I will press this tea and then be willing to wait a year or 2 years before it really peaks. And so, yeah, even though I really like the 2023 Dong Guo Gushu, I wanted to go up on the mountain. I wanted to drink the fresh stuff and see if it was as good as the 2023 stuff. Anyways, jumping forward in time a little bit while still remaining in the past. After checking out Shaohusai with Lanjie, we take the mountain road, down a few slopes, up a few slopes, all along the ridge, really dusty roads. And we get to the village of Dong Guo from Shaohusai. Again, this is all in Mengku, and Mengku is the southeast slope of the Dashui-shan, of that ancient primordial garden, potentially the birthplace of tea. This is right on like the southeastern slopes of it, this whole area. And so we get from one village to the next in a matter of, maybe 45 minutes or an hour. And it's amazing. It seems like these places are so close. But again, like before the advent of roads, before cars, they are isolated villages. And one thing I noticed as we were getting into Dong Guo, I really quickly realized why their Chiao Mu does not taste good. The whole side of the mountain was newly planted younger trees. Acres and acres and acres of small tree Dong Guo. And it was kind of sad because in this area where I don't see a whole lot of monoculture, this is what it felt like. It felt like there was a monoculture going on, just the entire slope of this mountain covered in young tree bushes. And then it's like, I remember drinking that tea and it wasn't good. It tasted forced. It tasted, sour, astringent, not so good. And I was like, okay, that's probably why. Let's see what this gushu looks like. So we get into the village and we take a look at their chawang, right? Their tea kings. These are usually the oldest trees in any village in Yunnan. They'll have one tree and they're like, this is our mushu, this is the mother bush, this is the chawang. It's the oldest tree we can find. And they'll decorate it in ribbons, they'll fence it off. You'll go, people go take photos with it, whatever. I wasn't super into this idea, but I really liked understanding Dong Guo village and the nature of the tea trees, because the village itself, the oldest tea trees are right in the village. Same thing I saw in Shaohusai. And so this is painting the picture of the Mengku area, of the Linsong area, like it's village tea. It's not Menghai jungle tea. It's not border tea in Yiwu in the national forest in the borders of Lao. The Mengku teas are civilized teas. The Linsong teas are village teas. And so they've been cultivated, they've been grown. Villages maybe grow around them. Ancient Qing dynasty kind of gardens idea, like really cultivated ideas here. Anyways, after a stroll around the old gardens, the old ancient tea trees, we visit Lanjie's connection up here. This is Brother Ma. And I say Brother Ma because we'll meet his older brother down in the lower Dong Guo. But up top, we're meeting younger brother Ma. Real quick, as I said the name, I remembered something I mentioned in the last episode. The village of Dong Guo has an interesting name, has an interesting story behind it. And I promise I'm not going to go back into a Sun Wukong rant, But Sun Wukong is based off The Journey to the West, one of China's four classic novels. And reading and playing the game, I feel like I'm in a part of history. And I've mentioned this last time when I was in Dong Guo. This village, Dong Guo, feels like it would be a village that I come into in The Monkey King, in the Journey to the West. It feels like the Chinese. It literally means like message, like lesson learned village, like something like I understand now village. And so the story behind it, I believe, is kind of a tragic story about the Han majority, hoodwinking the local Lahu minority in that area. The story goes like this. In the ancient times, the Lahu people of this area were some of the first minorities to settle in this region and start growing tea, even before the Dai people in Bingdao. The Lahu people were here, as I mentioned, in Shaohusai. It has a few Lahu villages. In Dong Guo, it was primarily all Lahu until the Han people started migrating into this area. The Han people brought a certain technology. This is the distillation technology of how to make really high alcohol spirits. And so they eventually started trading spirits, wine for tea, wine for resources, eventually wine for land. And it was here that the story turns a little tragic, where the Lahu people eventually started selling their land, their ancient tea gardens, to the Han minority in exchange for wine. And eventually, at some point, this stopped. The Lahu people had to move their village entirely from one area to a whole nother area on the mountain. And they called that village Lesson Learned Village, the Dong Guo Sun. Now, this is just a story. I don't know how much validity there is in it. Maybe it came after the fact, but it kind of explains similarly in Shaohusai, how Shaohusai has 2 Lahu villages and 3 Han villages, and the Dong Guo, has a huge Han village right next to it, and then the Dong Guo village, which is primarily Lahu. Anyways, we go from the old, massive trees in the middle of town to our friends, Little Brother Ma's smaller studio, kind of on the outskirts. And Brother Ma immediately takes us out to his tea garden. We see them in the trees picking teas. I take some good photos. This is where I see the sandals that are just falling apart, like the Converse with the soles falling out. Really interesting because it is similar to Shaohusai, where as I'm trying to take pictures of the people in the trees, the mountain is so steep that I'm having trouble just keeping an even footing. I'm sliding down all of this dirt, this tree cover, fallen leaves, fallen branches. Again, it's an incredible drought season, and so there's no solid purchase underfoot. But it was really nice to see the difference between, the Gushu tea trees and then the Chalmu tea trees, which, barely come up to, my shoulders, like maybe a meter and a half. The Gushus are clearly over 3 meters, very thick, very sturdy, climbable and all. They do have some lattice work, some scaffolding, usually more for them to stand because, like as I mentioned, it's such on a steep slope that it's kind of difficult to traverse. Anyways, after the customary garden tour, we go back to his little factory, Little Ma's factory, and we drink some tea. One thing that I get super excited about, way too excited than I should be, because Alex, the partner in One River Tea, he asked me to look for ancient methods of brewing tea in Yunnan. Particularly, he was looking at a chaguan, a tea jar. It's kind of like a vase with a handle made out of earthen work. And he was like, supposedly in Yunnan, they all drank tea out of this. They would roast it in the fire, put tea inside, the tea would start smoking, they would add hot water and pour it into cups. And he's like, if you find any of that, let me know, because we have a guy in we have a guy in Hubei who's making pots for us, and we'll start selling them later this month. And actually, if you've been keeping up with One River Tea, you know that we actually started selling those tea jars, the chaguans, and they've been selling really well, and people seem to really like them. Anyways, this is the first time I actually saw one in person, and it was in a very, very isolated village on the mountain, on the borders of China itself, like near Myanmar. This is Linsong, this is Dong Guo, Mengku, and I see this tea jar right on the middle of the table, and I get so excited. I point at it. I'm like, "What is this? What are you doing here?" And he's like, "This is how we make tea." I'm like, "What do you call it?" And he's like, "Oh, we call it a chagwan." And he starts laughing, and I'm like, "This guy, I'll tell you more about Brother Maul later. He's great. I really love him. He's a very genuine person." One of the happiest tea makers I've ever met, and he feels very natural. Feels very like he's not he's spontaneous, he's genuine, he's not affecting anything. He's not affecting his personality at all. Anyways, he tells me it's a chagwan, and he starts showing me how to use it. He's like, "Oh, you just throw tea in here, you set it here by the fire." Again, their hearth in their little kitchen, the fire is on the ground, the pots are in this little wire rack above it. And so they have just an actual banked fire with like woods and coals and stuff. And he shows me you just put it right there next to the fire. You throw tea in there, and then you pour boiling water in it. And he was like, I'll pour you a cup. And he pours me a cup. I drink, and it tastes great. I really like brewing raw puer tea like this. And maybe I'll tell you more later, but it really is. This is how I convinced Alex to drink more puer tea, was with one of these jars, and particularly with the Dong Guo tea. He really liked the Dong Guo Gushu tea. And so we drank a whole lot of that when we were sourcing teas in Sichuan, hanging out in Hubei. Anyways, after drinking some tea, I was trying to figure out, like, oh, is this Huang Pian tea that you're brewing? Is this last year's tea? Is this not good tea? He's like, no, this is just tea we're making today. It's fresh tea. It's pretty good. We just take some off the heap, some off the drying, and just throw it in here and drink it. And I'm like, that's cool intel. Anyway, after that, I was like, okay, I really do want to like sit down and do a gongfu session of some of your fresh tea. And Lanja's like, we should probably do that down in their actual factory down below in the lower village. So there's Dong Guo Shang, or Shang Dong Guo, and Sha Dong Guo. Shang means above, Sha means below. And so there are two villages. One is at kind of the crest of the mountain ridge, and the other is down at the foot of the mountain. Naturally, down at the foot of the mountain is probably a better place to make tea and make a factory, because you don't have to carry stuff up the mountain and down the mountain and up the mountain. And so, yeah, we go down there and get into the factory. And this whole time, like, seeing Brother Ma, seeing his personality, his natural affectation, like his style, like hemp garb, very loose-fitting clothing, very relaxed, very natural, easy to laugh, unassuming, unpretentious. And I get to his studio, his factory, and it's much more of the same. It's, in my mind, just like very natural, very, very, yeah, Taoist. And when we get in there, I take a tour of his studio. I meet his brother. His brother's like this more strong, like a kind of a buff Chinese guy. He's shirtless, but he has that same like happy, easygoing smile as the little brother Ma. Older brother Ma, he seems like a little more serious, maybe a little more business savvy, but still very natural. And the whole studio feels, I'm thinking how to describe it. Now, the Ma brothers, in my mind, are incredibly Taoist. And it's Taoist with a D, which is the modern pinyin way to say it. The old Taoism, right, with the T-A-O. This is a Wei Giles. This is a romanization of the Chinese language. Outsiders looking at Chinese and saying, how would we put that into our alphabet? Pinyin, the modern version, D with the Dao with a D. That is how the Chinese have decided to romanize their own language. And so for me, it makes more sense to use pinyin. It's more honorable. It's, let you tell me how to speak your language instead of me telling you. Anyways, Taoism. These guys are incredibly Taoist. The Tao, literally in Chinese, it's the character for the path, the way. And the idea here is that everything in this natural universe is following its own Tao, its own path, its own natural development. And the key word here is natural. This is how things, I don't want to say ought to be, because I think ought implies this external force. This is the natural development of things as they are. It's almost mindless. And so the idea here is that it is what will happen without any attempt. It's like how a baby grows into a human, how an acorn grows into an oak. This is the natural development. And you say, sure, every acorn wants to grow into an oak. But based on the certain circumstances, it doesn't always grow into the Platonic image of the perfect oak. And thus, the Tao is kind of, it doesn't really like the idea of perfection. It has the idea of everything is imperfect. Everything has its own natural Tao. And so no two acorns grow into the same two oaks. Nothing is how it ought to be. In fact, there is no ought to be. It is just according to its own nature. How this manifests, I would say, in the Ma brothers, in their way of making tea, in their studios and everything, it's very natural. It's very left to its own accord. They have, big reishi mushrooms growing on logs outside and inside, almost enshrined. Reishi mushrooms, or lingzhi, this is the mushroom of immortality. This is what they would use in ancient Taoist rituals to make, the pills, the medicines of the immortals. You eat this medicine and you can live for 1,000 years. You can turn into a crane. You can fly across mountaintops. It's a really cool mushroom. And it's one of the medicinal mushrooms in the West. In fact, a lot of people I know still take reishi mushrooms, powdered capsule versions of it, raises the immune system. I was on it for 2 years or so. Now with a few others like maitake, turkey tail, chaga, lion's mane. It was like a whole cocktail. Taoists always have this idea of immortality and they're trying to seek immortality. However, that kind of becomes a subsect to the actual philosophy. So potentially you could argue that this shamanistic idea is more real to the actual religion of Taoism versus the more romanticized view of the philosophy which I'm giving you. By all accounts, there is this much older version of Taoism that existed in the mountains, as I mentioned, like almost shamanistic, very similar to like pagan ideologies where the whole universe is alive, the world is alive, there's spirits everywhere, and humans are just a small part of it trying to find their place in it. However, you get immortals, you get other worlds, you get a lot of people in practice living on mountains in isolation, eating mercury, eating lead, eating gold, trying to really become immortal. Anyways, back to the way they set up their studio. There's reishi mushrooms growing enshrined. Behind it, there's a waterfall, a pond, and it's all kind of gone to seed. This is letting things grow without external interference. This is the natural universe. To potentially put the Tao into kind of Western ideology with the idea of good and evil, with the idea of sin, right? Where in the Christian ideology, sin is, I think one of the best ways I saw it put was it's detachment from God. This is the further away from God you get, the further into sin you get. Thus, God is that integration of the self with the cosmos, and sin is that disintegration. With the Tao, it's essentially integration with nature. With the Tao, what you're trying to do is you're trying to become as natural, as spontaneous, almost as animalistic as possible. And so this whole society that we live in, this whole world, humanity at large, what we're doing is we're trying to keep things from falling into that natural flow. We're resisting. We're fighting it. We're fighting dissolution at all costs. But with the Tao, you totally acknowledge disillusionment is part of life. Disintegration is part of life, right? We will dissolve and become part of nature again. And so any attempt to fight that is essentially friction, is essentially evil, is essentially sin. And like, if you want to put it in these really heavy contexts that you get in the West, in the Tao, it's just this is Tao and this is away from Tao. And a funny saying in the Tao, they say, even a dead fish can go with the river's flow. Or the idea, like, even if you're fighting the current of the river, you're still within the river's flow. And imagine this is like your body's eventual disintegration, right? The mechanism's dying, falling apart. Yeah, death comes for everyone. And fighting it is just this constant source of stress, of anxiety, of yeah, friction. And so I think it's really interesting to see, like, when I call these people Taoists and like a very Taoist center, it seems like, sure, they're praying to some spirits or gods or whatever, but no, what they're doing is they're just integrating themselves with the natural universe and letting things fall to the wayside, and they have this loose sense of control over everything. I think there's a really wonderful saying in the Tao Te Ching where it's actually the second chapter, and I love it so much I'll just give it to you in full. This is my translation of it. When the world knows beauty, ugliness is born. When it knows good, evil is born. Form and absence give birth to each other. Hard and easy depend upon each other. Long and short measure the other. High and low are determined by the other. Noise and sound constitute one another. Before and after follow one another. All bound without end. For this reason the sage handles all without touching. The way isn't taught. Thus the 10,000 things do, but are not pushed into motion. They are created, but not possessed. They act, but are not forced. Happen, but not urged. Accomplished, but not claimed. When the Tao does not take credit, everything is accomplished. And again, it just goes back to that acknowledgement that every single thing has its own unique path, its own unique development, its own unique Tao. And the more you try and shape it and force it into growing into the shape that you believe it should be, the more you detract from its own natural essence, right? And so imagine taking this ideology and putting it to tea, where you are just there as the means of creation. You create, but you do not possess. You allow the tea to grow and to change for other people to take it, press it, blend it, mix it, brew it up however they want. This is that true benevolent kind of freedom of creation without possession. Anyways, the Ma Brothers studio had that vibe. Like, these guys were so chill, so relaxed. They really didn't have a lot of worries and had that attitude. Like, the younger brother Ma was the fastest person to laugh I've ever met. Like, it was his natural reaction to almost anything. And I feel like in this cosmos, in this reality we live in, yeah, I think laughter is probably the best response to almost any any kind of situation, just because it's all relatively absurd when you really think about the grand vast picture of it all. But anyways, he was very friendly, very happy. He had this almost like braying laugh, like a donkey, right? You would hear it coming and it was contagious. It would make you laugh and smile as well. He was incredibly friendly and had kind of this natural sense of tea making. And of course, like, a lot of masters will have this natural sense of tea making. The more you make tea, the more you understand what needs to get done at a certain point. I remember he didn't want me taking videos of him withering the leaves on the concrete floor. He was like, oh, it's too dirty. Or it wasn't even dirty. They sweep all the time. They mop all the time. But it just doesn't look as nice. And so he wanted to show me, like, oh, if you want to take a video of it on the bamboo mats, because that looks prettier. And I was like, okay, why do you sometimes wither it on the concrete and sometimes on the bamboo mats? And he says, the shreni, the concrete absorbs the water faster. And so if I need it to wither down a little more quickly, I'll put it on concrete, because the concrete's thirsty and it will take all the water from the leaves very quickly. The bamboo mats, they insulate, they kind of slow it down. And so the stuff in the early morning that I'm not going to get to, I'll put on the bamboo mats. The stuff in the afternoon that I really want to make, in a few hours, I'll wither that on the concrete. And this was an interesting idea because I've seen tea makers do this in different places, in the Dansong, in the Wudong Mountains. This is what they're doing on the tops of their roofs. They have just huge platforms that are just like, poured concrete, and they'll dry the tea leaves or wither the tea leaves up there before making it. I've seen them do this in Taimushan, in Fuding as well. And again, it's just a very fast, quick way to wither the tea leaves, to dry the tea leaves, and just to achieve your different purposes, right? You can have them in the withering troughs, you can have them on bamboo mats, or you could have them on concrete, depending on your needs. One thing I will say about the Ma Brothers, and maybe it's not even the Ma Brothers, maybe it's just the season, maybe it's the tea leaves, maybe it's the my taste at the time. I did not like their recent teas. I tried their Gushu from 2024, and it was just okay. It was tasty, it was clean. It didn't taste like anything I'd had from Lin Song, but it didn't have that special something, right? And so like when I'm pressing 10, 15, 20 kilograms of tea, I want something special. I don't want something just, oh, it's okay. Oh, it's good enough. Like, good enough doesn't mean I'm going to press it into a cake. Good enough maybe means I'll buy a little bit to sample later, do an educational box or something like that. But I want something really special. And so I was drawn back to the idea of the stuff I had had before I even went to Dong Guo. This was the 2023 Gushu that was just absolutely phenomenal. Now, here's one funny story that happened when I was sourcing tea in the studio. This is down in their bigger factory in Dong Guo. Dong Guo means below the mountain. Lower Dong Guo. Dong Guo is at the top of the mountain. And at the top of the mountain, they have their gardens, they have their tea trees, they have a smaller studio where they can make tea very, very fresh right off the mountain. The large amount of tea they make down here in this larger studio. And so I was taking a tour of this large studio. I saw their reishi mushrooms in the place where I would usually see a shrine. I saw the back end of their studio where they have that little pond, the nice little waterfall, weeds everywhere, algae clogging everything. Something beautiful, the running water, but a very natural sense to the whole scene. I saw their really clean place where they're drying out their teas, withering their teas. And then in one thing, which turned out to be the kitchen, I see a bunch of guys, I think like 12 guys, all shirtless, sitting around a small table playing cards, drinking alcohol, and eating what turns out to be these little fried river shrimp. I think maybe salted river shrimp, but I don't even think they were fried. And I'm, around taking photos. I have two cameras, a microphone, a drone at this time. I look like a ridiculous tourist. And I'm just like, okay, like I'll snap a few photos. And then eventually they wave me over. They invite me to play the game. And I'm trying to figure out this card game. It's like poker, but you never go past the first round. You just see everyone gets dealt two hands, you get a 3-card flop, and then whoever has the best hand wins. And then after you win, you get to dish out a certain number of drinks to a certain number of people. And the way they had this like, it would actually, this is funny, it actually turned out to be Bing Dao liquor. They were very proud of it. Bing Dao liquor, it's like 45% alcohol. And the guy has like a screw off plastic Coca-Cola bottle cap tied to what looked like a part of a hanger. And that was his little thimble to measure out the drinks, right? And so, I started, he gave me 12 of those little thimble full of the drinks. We play a few rounds. I have no idea what's going on. Everyone's just drinking and laughing and playing cards, eating shrimp. And eventually I do win one hand. And I'm so excited. I take a little selfie with all the people hanging out. And there's this one guy who's just like covering his face. He's like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. And I felt bad, so I never posted the selfie. I was like, okay, I probably should have asked their permission or whatever, but I was pretty excited. Eventually that guy, I sat next to him at dinner, and it turned out he was like a school teacher. And so he's like, oh yeah, there's culture, and there's good culture, and there's, deep culture, and then there's Linsang, Yunnan culture. Like, Linsang Yunnan culture is the heart of Yunnan. This is the real Yunnan. You can't see this anywhere else. And I'm like, yeah, it feels really natural, feels really raw. Dinner, by the way, was really awesome. It was all cooked over one of those kind of exposed hearths where they're making the fire on the ground. They have this huge wok, and everything is prepared in either 1 or 2 woks. We had a lot of different dishes, some egg, some peppers, some beef, some pork, some soups. I forget the details of it, but my friend Michael, who He's a chef in Guangzhou, Michael Rosenblum. And he was like, I posted a photo of it, and he's like, oh, is that larb? Is that a kind of larb? And I was like, what is larb? I looked it up. It looks like it's a Thai kind of food that is, it's minced pork, it's maybe ground rice, a lot of peppers, some lime. And he described it, or I looked it up, and I was like, yeah, that's pretty much what it was. Like, how did you know that? He's like, oh, yeah, in southern Yunnan, like this area, there's a lot of like transference between like Thai and these Southeast Asian cultures and their food. You can kind of trace the genealogies of the different peoples based on their food traditions. He's getting his PhD in the anthropology of food from Hong Kong. He's a really amazing guy, and I was like, this is fascinating information. And for me, right, I was just there. I'd played cards, drank some of that Bingdao Baijiu, some of that Bingdao alcohol, and I was just eating whatever food came in front of me. But then there's so much more to these cultures. There's so much more depth you can get into if you look at it from different perspectives. Like the anthropology of food is one side. For me, obviously, I'm very into tea. And then there's my friend, the teacher, who was like, this Linsong culture is the true Yunnan culture, which, everyone will probably say that. But it makes me want to take a second look at it and be like, okay, like what is that specific culture he is talking about? That is not, Yunnan in the north, Yunnan in the south. This is Linsong, which is kind of neither. It's kind of closer to Myanmar almost. Anyways, my friend Lanjia helped me not, get totally wasted at dinner because they kept wanting to get me to drink more and more of this really strong alcohol. But we had business to do, right? Like I wanted to figure out what teas I wanted to buy from these people, if I wanted to buy any of their 2024, if I wanted to press anything at all. And so, yeah, so she, helped prevent them from getting me super drunk. I'm grateful. And then eventually we were drinking a little more tea. We drank some danju. And again, similar to Xiao Husai, I was not impressed with the danju. Danju, again, means single tree. And it's this covetous term. Like a lot of people really, really want danju. But if the tree isn't right, if the tree isn't the right tea, I don't know. For me, it's less of a spectrum and more of a depth where it's like, okay, like if you really understand this region and you really understand this tea, this tree from year to year to year, you can understand a lot more of the flavor depths. But if you're new to this entire region, if you're not, buying the same tea from the same tree year after year, maybe danju isn't for you. And you can just explore this wider range of flavor profiles from different terroir regions, right? Because in Dong Guo, they have a lot of different trees, and the trees are mixed together. They're picked, and the leaves are all mixed together. And so you get usually the same age of trees, but from different parts in the mountain. Slightly different soil, chemical compositions, slightly different depths, slightly different sun, rain, whatever. And it all gets kind of blended together, pin-pay, if you will, this mixing. And then you get that whole flavor profile from the village instead of just a single tea or a single tree. So yeah, as it's starting to get dark, and remember, this is the same day as when we went to Xiaohusai. And so it's been a long day of sourcing, a long day of driving, of meeting new people, of tasting new teas. We finally are like, okay, let's go back into town. And so we're getting ready to go back into town. And then little brother Ma comes over and is like, hey, can I get a ride? We're like, okay. And so we give him a ride. And like he sits next to me and he's just talking up Lanjie all the way back. They're laughing. He's laughing so much. We get into the city and he's like, let me out by this park. And she's like, oh, okay. So she drives near that park. It's the park in the middle of the town. And he's like, this is good. This is good. Just stop here. And we stop there and he just gets out. And I'm just like, what a guy. Like, how is he going to get back out to Dong Guo, right? Like, anyways, he's a mystery to me. I really like him. But we go back to Lanjie's studio and we kind of talk about the teas. And this is when I kind of expressed that I didn't like the Danju and I didn't like the 2024 teas. And Lanjie says, she agrees. she's like, yeah, it really, it was lacking something. It was like water, a little watery, which is strange because they didn't have any rain. But the term here is like it was a little dan, a little weak. And for me, I expressed, I was like, I really liked 2023. And she was like, if you like the 2023, just press 2023. And I was like, I can do that. And I guess this is a little more on my side of things, where it's spring 2024. I'm sourcing teas that are just being released. Like, am I kind of like copping out by selling a tea from last year, right? Pressing a tea that was made a year ago instead of the tea that's super fresh right now. But at the same time, I want to press something I'm excited about. And so I went for the 2023 and I pressed that. Now, for me, I call this tea Tropics. For the wrapper, I put a picture of some green bananas that I took out on the mountain on the wrapper cover. And it's kind of funny. Like, a lot of Chinese people really don't understand the packaging. Even Lanjie was like, why are there bananas on this? You're not selling bananas. This tea has nothing to do with bananas. And for me, I call it Tropics because it's like, it's right on the Tropic of Cancer, right? We're really close to the Tropic of Cancer. This is in the tropics, and there are banana trees everywhere. And for me, this Dong Guo, this cake I pressed, the 2023 Pure Gushu, it has a different kind of taste than a lot of the other Linsang teas. It's a little more pungent, a little more strong, potentially astringent, potentially bitter, but as I drink it now, it's really not bitter. But it has almost that fruit esters kind of fragrance to it that I did not get from a lot of other teas up here. And so for me, it was the closest one to like this kind of like tropical, citrus, juicy kind of tea. Even though, I guess, as I'm saying this, I know that the Bang Dong teas, those are really much like Gatorade, like juice, like Sunny D. And so maybe I'm being a little too close-minded about Linsang fruity teas. Anyways, I really like this tea. It was really quickly one of my favorites, and actually one of Alex's favorites. So I got a lot of this tea loose because obviously if I'm pressing it, I can't really drink it immediately. And so this is in my spring tea trip, and this episode here will conclude my time in Linsang. This year in Linsang, I didn't have time to press the teas and watch them be pressed because I had to move on. After leaving Linsang, I got all of the teas that I was pressing in their Maocha form, put them in my backpack, and I moved on. Again, in Linsang this year, I pressed, I think, 6 cakes. There's the Shigui, which is a blend of Gushu and Chaomu. Gushu from last year's autumn, Chaomu, which is the younger trees from this year's spring. This is the Shigui, and I call it Lux. I pressed it in 100-gram cakes because it's a little more affordable that way than pressing it in the 200-gram cakes because it's almost $1 a gram. This is very expensive teas. The Xiaohu Sai, that was the blend I mentioned in the last episode. That one was also a blend of autumn Gushu and spring Chaomu. Different ratio, just because it was their Chaomu was a little, I guess their Gushu was a little stronger than the Shigui stuff. Anyways, that is called the new kicks. A picture on the cover is the Nikes or the Adibas. The Adibas with the backwards D in the tree. Put that on the wrapper. That one's really good. Those two are some of my favorites. But actually, as I mentioned, the Dong Guo quickly became my favorite. This is a 200-gram cake, and the cover has bananas on it. Really, really funny for me. It's the Tropic of Cancer. Speaking of funny, I did the skinny chicken. This is the Kuashan Chaomu 200-gram cakes. It's just a chicken, and then around the chicken, I wrote a bunch of math equations. And the chicken looks really, really serious at the camera when I took this photo. And I don't know, for me, this just makes me laugh. There's really no rhyme or reason to it other than it makes me laugh. And then there's the New York City Tap Water. That's the Pure Gushu blend, or Pure Gushu, not blend, single origin tea from Dong Guo, or from Bangdong. This is a tea I dreamed about pressing last year, but I just didn't have the funds for. This year I finally, instead of pressing a blend of like the Chow Mu or the Younger Bushes, I just did pure Gushu, and I pressed this tea cake. On the cover is a digital collage I made of a bunch of black and white photos of New York City in the 1980s. I initially got the idea from Billy Woods. He released a new album called Maps in 2023. And the second to last song, I think the penultimate song, was called NYC Tap Water, New York City Tap Water. And for me, it's one of the best songs on the album. I really vibed with it. I really liked it. And, I was listening to it as I was making that collage. Another thing that draws me to it is Ai Weiwei, who's a famous Chinese artist. Really, really cool, slightly controversial artist in China, one of the designers of the 2008 Bird's Nest Stadium. He actually spent some time in New York City in the 80s when he was younger. And I found a picture of Ai Weiwei in New York, black and white photo in the 80s, and I put that on the cover. And initially the whole cover was just him. But then eventually I found more photos and I started doing a digital collage. I really like the way that one turned out. The final one was a tea I pressed kind of last minute. It was a white tea from Lin Song, but it was so beautiful. It tasted so good. The leaves were so beautiful. And I was so inspired by it. I did another digital collage of bamboo with a chain link fence. And then I called it the mithril, just because bamboo has silica in it. Bamboo has this kind of like really strong glass-like structure. A lot of like buildings and construction here utilize bamboo as support beams and stuff like that. It's very strong, and yet when you look at it, it bends in the wind. It's very bendy. It's very Taoist, and so it's something that's very light, very gentle, and yet very strong. This tea, too, it looks very beautiful, tastes really great, but it has a huge amount of depth to it, a huge amount of life to it. You can brew it for 12, 15, 20 times, and it's still great. So with that, we kind of conclude the end of my Lin Song sourcing, at least for 2024. After this, I go out to Jianshui and I start looking for teaware. That's part of Tao Teaware. If you're interested in that, check out Between the Cracks. That's a podcast that we do, Dart and I, and Tao Teaware, and it's up on YouTube. Between the Cracks on YouTube, on the Tao Teaware channel, and we'll probably talk about my time in Jianshui there. If you also want to see my beautiful face as I'm talking, that's where you can do it. And it's not just a audio only podcast, but complete video podcast. And we have pretty nice cameras, so my face looks, great in 4D, I guess. Anyways, after this episode, what I'll start doing is I'll start inviting Alex, my partner in the cooperative, into the Tea Soup episodes. We've done a few together, and we'll probably just start doing a few more, because after this, I go out to Hubei and Hefeng, and I make some white tea myself, and then we make it together with the villagers. We'll talk about this whole process, and we'll talk about the tea jars. We'll talk a little more about white tea and One River tea and everything we're doing out there. I'll also have Alex tell us a little bit about his recent sourcing trip to Junshan. Junshan is one of the ancient origins of yellow tea. And we'll talk about the teas we found, and we'll probably release them October or November. But anyways, thank you for listening to this episode of Tea Soup. I hope you enjoyed my tangents, and I hope you are thinking about playing Song Wukong, the Monkey King, Black Myth. And yeah, if you like any of the teas, if you like the stories, be sure to support us by going over to onerivertea.com, buying some beautiful teas that are all sourced directly, and you know the people that these teas come from now. Even that white tea that we recently gave away, that was pressed by Wu, and Wu has his own Tea Soup podcast. I think it's like episode 5. It's Guangyang in Fuding. He was a coal miner and he became a tea maker. He looks very young. He says coal mining kept him young. Amazing. He's the guy who pressed our white tea cake, the Brown Mountain, which we just released. Anyways, I'm going to go to bed now. It's getting pretty late, and tomorrow I'm going to do a whole lot of work getting new Dan Song oolongs up on the website. Until then, guys, this is Derek from One River Tea. Brew happy.